Hello and welcome to Unleashed, the show that explores how to thrive as an independent professional. Unleashed is produced by Umbrex, and you can sign up for our weekly email at umbrex.com/unleashed. I'm your host, Will Bachman, and I'm really excited to be here today with Tekla back. I've been wanting to do this episode for a long time. Tekla is a McKinsey alum. She's the former Senior Vice President of Strategy at PepsiCo, and she is the founder of a snack bar brand called Keho, which is spelled Keho, Keho. And she is also working on some advocacy around nutritional labels, which is what we'll talk about today. So, Tekla, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. Super excited.
And I don't even think we'll necessarily have time to get into the fact that you have a graduate degree, PhD in physics, as well as a degree in fashion from FIT. So multidimensional, a lot of interests. So Tekla, tell me a little bit about how you got interested in nutritional labels. I know that you are incredibly knowledgeable about all the different nutritional trends out there, but what got you interested in nutritional labels?
I think it goes all the way back to university and crew. I coxed lightweight women, so dieting was like a thing. And then I ended up spending 20 years in food and beverage, first as a consultant at McKinsey and then at PepsiCo heading up strategy. So nutrition has always been a huge passion for me. And honestly, that physics is relevant too, because it means I know my way around a scientific paper. And through leaving PepsiCo and becoming utterly obsessed with the keto diet, like so many before me, I kind of went into this deep hole and emerged on the other side, questioning my 20 years in food and beverage, where I felt like the fish that had been in the water but hadn't seen the water. And now with this sort of new education, I want to relook at everything. And the nutritional label is the thing that everybody sees. It is our one truth for what's in a product. And I became super passionate about ensuring that that one truth actually tells people what they're actually eating.
Okay, so and to give some context for people, you are part of a kind of advocacy group that you know helping to organize to change the labels.
Yeah, so we're just kicking it off. I gave a speech last year at a doctor's conference, and a guy who was running for senator came up to me afterwards, and he's like, you should do this as a citizen's petition. One of the challenges with the industry and the way that these labels are made is that the FDA is very unique among all of the governmental bodies in that it is 45% funded by industry. And there's been previous efforts to change what the nutritional label looks like, and they haven't succeeded. They've been really tiny inches forward over the years. So this is probably an opportunity for consumers from more of a grassroots level and smaller brands. And basically this whole new push around revising the food industry coming together to change nutritional labels. So everyone jump abroad, jump aboard.
Okay, so what is wrong with the nutrition facts label now? So we have it and just to refresh your memory, you can maybe pull out some product from your shelf while we go through the show here. We have calories, it says total fat, grams of fat, cholesterol, sodium, total carbs, protein, then it goes over vitamin A, C, calcium, iron. So what is the problem with that?
So the one thing I'd love to talk about, and it's actually going to be our first push, is the visual. I'm not going to do it here, given the fact that podcasts are not a visual medium. I'll just leave it at there's a lot of work that has happened in other countries on shifting from this black and white written table to more of a visual presentation. And that's step one, which actually doesn't change any of the information, but would make it more readable. Not for this conversation, but that's actually going to be our first push. And then after that, the information falls into two buckets. The first is the grams, the content of what's actually in there. And you could really call that the nutrition facts. And then the second thing is that column called percent daily value.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where things get more controversial, because that's when you're really talking about recommended levels of things. So we'd love to tackle it as design, content, percent daily recommendations.
All right, well, let's talk through some of these. So, um, you know, let's talk about the section that talks about total fat here. So it breaks it out, gives you the total grams, but then that's per serving. and they can always play around with the number of servings per container, I guess.
Yeah.
And then there's and they break that out to saturated fat and trans fat.
Yep.
So what sort of concerns do you have about the way that the fat mounts are? And by the way, it says like 8 grams of fat, and I don't really know, is that good, bad? I mean, who knows? It's like, okay, 8 grams, it seems like a very small amount. What is that, like a few paper clips or something, a tablespoon? I don't know.
Yeah.
So put that in context for me. How would you reshape that section?
You're already touching on one of my favorite things, which is why is the recommended amount in big bold numbers in calories and everything else in grams, and you actually can't do the math between the two? Idiotic. Like, the level of math that is assumed of a consumer is ridiculous. Fats are 9 calories per gram, and carbohydrates and proteins roughly 4. No one's going to do that math when you're choosing what to eat. On fats specifically, I think some of the most exciting research is happening right now. And that historically, the FDA position was that fat equals cancer. Literally, fat equals cancer. You can read through a lot of the content, but that is the punchline. And one of the things that's really interesting is in this last set of nutritional changes that they made, they actually changed the recommended daily value from 65 grams to 78 grams, which again may not sound like much, but that's a 20% increase. And for the first time, we're starting to have this conversation on what's a good fat and what's a bad fat. And you mentioned sat fats, and that's perhaps the most contentious area, particularly for those of us who are in the keto world. But traditionally, they've been maligned as the bad fats. And it's getting increasingly clear that actually that research has been faulty, because we used to think that sat fats led to either cardiovascular disease or higher rates of death. And now it actually looks like that's not true, because the link to LDL cholesterol, which is the bad cholesterol, is actually no longer true. You can't see that it's driving higher rates of death. And trans fats, I get medium excited about, because almost always now, whatever label you look at, there is 0. So they're kind of a waste of space on the label, but they also demonstrate why labeling works, because historically that was the thing that was proven to be bad, and almost everyone took them out of the products. So I kind of have a love-hate relationship with trans fats. I'm anti them on the label because we're almost out of them. I think they should just be banned from foods. And then they also give me hope, because they show that the labels drive change.
And remind me, what is trans fats? Is that
So trans
what's an
fats were
example of that?
kind of a byproduct when manufacturers turned vegetable oils into hard fats like shortening or margarine. And that's where they really came to be. There's not that many that are truly naturally occurring. The naturally occurring ones, people would argue, aren't actually that bad for you. It is these manufactured trans fats that are associated with metabolic diseases. They're actually banned in a number of countries.
So does that include like margarine and like Cisco and stuff like that?
Yeah, I would have to look on specifically the Cisco label, because it's not something I have in my cupboard, but probably. But vast majority of those products have now been reformulated, so trans fats almost everywhere is effectively 0.
Oh, okay, that's good.
You're unlikely to find a product where you actually see a big gram number on the trans fat label.
Okay. And then, yeah, I always get a little kind of skeptical of all this nutritional labeling. And you kind of default to the Michael Pollan type guidances. I don't know if I can quote it,
Yeah,
but like basically eat plants, only a little bit of meat, and don't eat too much is basically his guidance, right? And sweets, and no sweets, or very little. And if you kind of follow that guidance, you're probably going to be okay. Just try to eat kind of natural food, because it seems like the guidance always keeps shifting around. Like eggs were bad for a long time, and now it's like, okay, maybe eggs are just fine. But kind of let's keep going. So cholesterol. So it lists out cholesterol in milligrams. What should we know about cholesterol?
I mean, that's a perfect example of what you just said. It was thought to be bad for you, then good for you, then bad for you. And a lot of that was based in this thinking that eating cholesterol leads to high cholesterol, which is now very clearly demonstrated through the fat heart hypothesis that the two are not necessarily related. And more importantly, um, as the level of cholesterol came down in people, uh, LDL, the bad cholesterol, heart disease didn't come down. And it's really funny when you go to the FDA website, it actually no longer even says that cholesterol is bad. It just says that it's associated with high fat foods. So we're actually kind of capturing that saturated fat and cholesterol twice on the label. It's like playing repeat. And there's a lot of evidence that suggests consumers only see 3 to 5 things on the label. So why would you waste space on something that you're already saying somewhere else?
And then it has sodium on there, which, salt basically. I probably eat way too much salt, but what's your take on that? So I mean, it gives it milligrams, and I have milligrams. I mean, I'm even kind of a sort of sciencey guy. I mean, I majored in physics,
Yep.
but telling me that there's 160 milligrams, that it's not. It doesn't really resonate with me. The 7%, okay, 7%. So that
Yep.
means I can eat 13 of these per day if I don't eat anything else, I guess.
Yep.
Um, but what's your thought about this sodium thing?
What you said in that the math is ridiculous. And just to make it even more fun, sodium is not salt. Sodium chloride is salt, of which about 40% is sodium. So as you're doing that math, you have to make sure that in packaged goods you're putting this adjustment for the 40% versus the stuff that you sprinkle on your food.
Mm-hmm.
And there's evidence again that suggests even for people who are hypertensive and hence have issues with high salt sensitivity, if they reduce their salt consumption by roughly a factor of 2, it gives them like 5 points in blood pressure. And given the fact that only half of people who are hypertensive typically are salt sensitive, and a quarter of normal people are salt sensitive, again, why would it be so high on the label if it is something that only applies to a subsegment of people? And again, I'm like, fine, this may matter for some, but it doesn't matter for most. So, for example, should sugars be that far below sodium? In my mind, not.
Yeah, so that's the next thing that has total carbohydrates and then gives you 37 grams in my little example here. Then it says dietary fiber, 4 grams, and sugars, 12 grams. So how would you change that? I mean, sugars, it seems to be, are something that you really should be paying attention to.
Totally agree. This is actually one of the sections where I'd probably, if I could let go of that sat fat number above, which fingers crossed is going to be close, this is the section where I do the most major rewrite. Sugars is really fascinating because all other countries, the World Health Organization, a lot of the other countries that have come out with sugar recommendations, they don't talk about added sugars and total sugars. So can you see there's like 2 lines on the version that you're looking at? And there is a percent daily value for added sugars, but not total sugars. And that's because there is a very strong sugar lobby that managed to get through that if it's naturally occurring in the product, it shouldn't be included, which is nuts because things like orange juice are over 90% sugar, but because it's naturally occurring, it would actually say that there is no recommended value for that sugar. It's a 0. It's insane. And just to make it more insane, the total sugar number that the World Health Organization has come up with is roughly 50 grams a day. They actually say you get benefits from going down to 25 grams a day. The US equivalent for just added sugars is 50 grams. And if you do that fun math again and play with this label, that actually means that you can be within the US dietary guidelines eating 200 grams of sugar. And now, if you do more math, that's half of your daily calories could come from some form of sugar, which is kind of nuts. The other thing that's worth mentioning is the US is unique in having this line item here called dietary fiber. There's actually not a global definition of what fibers are. The US includes so-called functional fibers that I, for example, use in my bars, and those are things that act in your body as fibers. They go straight through you. But it'd be kind of nice to come up with a consistent definition. And over the past 2 years, there have been a number of citizens' petitions, like the one that we want to do, contesting what is a true fiber and what's not a true fiber. And actually, a number of the products that were masquerading as true fibers have now fortunately been taken out of the market. By the end of this year, even small brands will be gone. So that's a really, really big deal, because it means that that stuff doesn't cause stomach upsets for some people who are sensitive to them. And then I think the other thing we should do is add a line for what are net carbs. A lot of us keto people calculate them, or what are starches, so that you don't have to be doing this math yourself. And today, if you're a keto person in particular, there's a lot of fancy math on the Atkins boxes or the bulletproof boxes for whether it has a sugar, alcohol, and whether you count it as a half a carb or you don't count it, or there's just a lot of math in here again that doesn't need to be there. I think it should be simply dietary fiber, net carbs, and total sugars, without this distinction between sugars and added sugars.
And then protein, just hanging out there, it says 3 grams. There's no percentage of daily value on this. Just
Spot on.
3 grams. Like, okay, well, I don't know. That seems, I don't know, is that good? How many should I have?
So I've always wondered, and this is a hypothesis according to me, no one else. I think the reason why the protein doesn't have a percent daily value is, if it did, you could work out the number for sugar. And actually, there are protein recommended daily values for infants and pregnant women, for example. Plus, if the product makes a protein claim, of which there are now tons, you actually do need to have a percent daily value. So it's kind of, sometimes we have an opinion, sometimes we don't have an opinion. And one of the reasons that's making protein particularly important right now is the rise of plant-based products. Because if you go and pick up a milk, like a plant-based milk, like Ripple, on the front, it says it's got 8 grams of protein. And if you pick up a grass-fed milk, that also says it has 8 grams of protein. But if you flip to the back, one of them, the plant-based version, has got 11% of your daily value, and the animal version has got 16% of your daily value, which again might not sound like a lot, but when you start thinking about drinking 6 glasses a day or 9 glasses a day, that number gets pretty big. And the reason I'm so passionate about this protein conversation right now is the rise of plant-based foods and products. And because not all proteins are created equal, I think we should come up with a metric that allows those of us who don't eat meat to make more informed choices between the different products. And by the way, today's protein test is actually done using rats, so it's not very animal friendly, and there are vegan alternatives out there. So there's a whole sort of a space around educating people on what proteins are. This could be done at the level of, essential amino acids that we can't make in our body versus those that we actually can make in our body, or it could be just literally providing the math so that you knew what was in the product. But definitely an area that I think should be pushed on.
Tell us a little bit about what you've learned about sort of what the different forces are, and lobbying groups and interest groups that have a say or are like lobbying around this nutrition facts box that we see on our food. And you said it's the FDA that sort of decides what this looks like.
So the FDA defines the so-called dietary guidelines. They are the people who are in charge of then translating those guidelines into what schools eat, for example, which is why it's super important, what the military eats, what people in prison eat. They have a huge, and what food stamps fund. So they are arguably the most important body for defining the column on the right, percent daily values. The actual nutritional label is actually managed by the Health and Human Services Group, which is a subsidiary of the FDA. One of the things that makes this super challenging is that those bodies also coexist with the USDA, which is the US Department of Agriculture. I think the FDA actually goes through there. So the same people who have got a vested interest in pushing some of these products are making the rules or suggestions for what we should actually eat. And then the challenge is obviously unlike any other governmental body, the FDA by definition has to put its recommendations into industry review. So if you, for example, look at the nutritional label that was developed, I think in 2016 by Michelle Obama as part of our Let's Move program, what was recommended and went into the system is completely different than what came out of the system. And what came out of the system looks a lot like what we had. And for example, just even internally, the group that makes these recommendations was pushing taking the added sugar level from 10% of your daily calories, which is where it is today, down to 6%. And it couldn't get traction despite the fact that that's what the science would actually recommend.
Who actually is responsible for kind of measuring the numbers, and does anybody kind of check up on a company and take the
Great
graham
question.
crackers off the shelf and go independently test them and give them a fine if it's wrong? I mean,
So the FDA is responsible. They act more on, they more police the big companies as opposed to the small companies. And that's actually a real challenge. It's, by the way, different in structure than from most other countries. And what it means is that a lot of the products that you see on the shelf who are making a claim about it's calming or it gives you energy or it's good for your joints, we didn't even get to claims, but claims are often not true because they're not actually policed by the FDA, and products don't have to go through some sort of a checking process. What tends to happen is they police the Pepsis, the Cokes, the General Mills, and a lot of the policies made at that level, which is great because those companies also represent the majority of the consumption. But when I was sitting on the other side of the table at PepsiCo, it was frustrating because all these small companies would be making health claims that you wouldn't be able to make. So it's a little bit of an unfair playing field.
yeah. Now, I imagine that you've gone through this process with your company, with Keho. What's it like getting the nutrition facts label done? Are there labs that you pay to get your product evaluated, or what's the actual process to get those numbers and have them officialized and certified?
You can do it simply by adding up the nutrition content. It's unlikely that anyone's going to check. Particularly when you're smaller, you can take it a step further and you can go to a lab exactly as you say. And within there, you can choose the level of rigor that you put into those tests. Are you going to burn it and see what ash is left? Are you going to do the different protein tests, which are not mandatory? So it's left a lot to the choice. And that's why these independent certifying bodies, for whether it's non-GMO, fair trade, or keto, are starting to spring up because that program doesn't exist centrally.
Okay. What historically has been the impact on the food we eat when the FDA makes a change in the nutrition facts label? Do you know any history around that, where they've made some change and added something? I mean, we talked about one, the trans fat kind of getting. Are there other examples where the label changed and then the food we ate actually changed as a result?
I think trans fats is probably the example. The other thing I would say, and it's why I'm so passionate about the world of keto, is the dietary guidelines, which started to come out, I think, in the 70s or 80s, are the ones that recommended lowering the amount of fat in our diet. And if you look at the trends for what people are consuming, they have reduced the amount of fat in their diets and they've reduced the amount of sugar in their diets. So these recommendations are really changing how consumers behave. Now, the FDA would say that not enough people are still within the guidelines, so they've reduced, but they're not low enough. Whereas I would argue those recommendations are actually misguided because they don't take into account total carbohydrates, for example, and because they malign fats. You could make the argument that they're also impacting people's satiety and hormonal systems, and there's a biology in action that is greater than just the sum of the calories approach that's been adopted to date.
You know, I'm curious your thoughts on what is missing from this, and I'll throw out a couple ones, which is, we try to buy organic fruits when we can, right?
Mm,
But one thing that you just never know, which would be kind of neat to see on the label, would be, for non-organic as well as organic, is okay, like how much actual insecticide residue is left on this. Like you just don't really have a sense of that, so that'd be kind of interesting for me to see. And same thing with like with milk. We normally buy organic milk, but be interesting to see, okay, like how much actual like hormones is left in this product itself that you might consume. Some of those things which might be trace amounts, but would be kind of interesting to see. What?
what an interesting idea. I mean, that's an interesting idea. And in some ways, there are examples of it. Like, for example, the one that pops to mind is caramel color. There was a whole lawsuit, and I'm sorry, I can't remember the number of it, that was more California based on when you cook products through the Brownian motion, the Maillard action, you get this brown residue, the burnt bits, and the burnt bits actually cause cancer. And those are things that have been tracked. So I could imagine there being something similar. I think I'm more back to basics. I would love to see that stuff happen, but I feel like we're still at the level where the average consumer can't even look at a label and work out how many of a single unit they're eating and how much of a single unit they should be eating, whether it should be calories, whether it should be grams, whether it should be percentages. And I would even love to get to that at the level of fat, carbohydrate, protein, literally simplistically three different metrics, and have a way of communicating that in a way that most people would read. And then I think all the rest of it should come. I mean, just as an example of that, when's the last time you changed your vitamin intake based on all these vitamin numbers here? Like, nobody reads it.
Yeah,
Why is it on a piece of paper? Why do we waste time, space, and print that could be used to educate people?
yeah, that part seems pretty worthless. Like vitamin A, 10%, vitamin C, 8%. At least what I've read about vitamins, and I'm curious, you've looked at this, is that most people that are getting a regular, varied diet are getting all the vitamins they need. And at least what I've read is that taking like a multivitamin is sort of a waste for most sort of healthy people. And so all this stuff on the vitamin A, C, calcium, iron, it's just like wasted space. But what do you think about that?
So it's funny you should say that. I'm actually currently working on a piece to get under the hood of that myself. I think there's definitely evidence that says there are people with nutritional deficiencies in women, particularly anemia, that where it helps to have supplementation. That said, I've also been reading an equal number of articles that says actually vitamins don't work. So I'm personally holding back my conclusion. The one thing I have tried to do myself personally is there's a distinction between water-soluble vitamins and fat-soluble vitamins. And the fat-soluble stuff stays in your cells. The water-soluble stuff just gets rinsed out of your system and you're unlikely to do damage. So those are the ones I take because why not? And the fat-soluble ones I tend to be a little bit more careful of.
Yeah. So I guess overall, it's definitely a visual kind of design question here where just this rows of data don't really help you make much of an informed decision about products. Where if it was some kind of indication of almost like if you're eating this for lunch, it should be the only thing you eat because there's so many calories in this, or this is like super healthy in terms of the nutritional value per like volume of per volume of the product or per calorie or something. It's just
Yep.
and I mean some things are like 8 servings per bag, but maybe I'll just eat like the whole bag of Doritos or something. So they should scale it up by 8. It's It's hard to get your
It's
head around the value of these
it's
numbers.
so challenging. And it's funny, I was trying to work on a nutritional density index to see if I could arrive at that, and found a whole bunch of people, by the way, some amazing people in Oxford who seem to have done the same thing. Um, but it's always really hard to come up with a single number because everyone follows different diets and they have different needs. So, and having that single number kind of hides the information below. So I kind of just dream of having the simple numbers on a page, no more, no less, because the average consumer is going to read 5 numbers max, more likely 3. So I think there's a huge opportunity to simplify. And one of the other challenges that are happening right now is because the industry is doing its own thing. They're starting to come up with front of pack labeling. I don't know if you've noticed, but sometimes on your products you see labels on the front and the back.
Mm-hmm.
So you're just adding more versus simplifying what exists. And it's kind of a tall order to go back and change this thing, but there are examples of countries that have done it, and the evidence is coming in that it actually does work. So I feel pretty passionate about getting the basic information down for people, no more, no less.
You almost think that a different approach would be like some kind of dimension that just says how often could you eat this. So if it's carrots, it just says eat as many of these as you want. It's like super healthy. And if it's meat, it's like, hey, eat 1/4 cup of this every other day is fine, but more than that is not so great. And if it's like pasta, it says, well, eat this once a week or something, or twice a week, and then you're okay. I don't know, something that just, instead of these just the strict percentages that, frankly, I mean, most Americans probably have no clue what 8 grams
Yeah.
means.
Yeah.
Something more that's more actionable, like that you can communicate to connect more to just day-to-day lived experience.
You actually just touched on one of my favorite things from a slightly different angle, which is, I would argue, this is where it depends a little bit on what diet you follow. Because if you're a keto person, you actually don't want to eat carrots because they're really high in sugar. Or if you're a carnivore person, you're actually going to eat a lot of meat. So I kind of want to take the conversation away from the source of that nutrient and focus it much more on the nutrient. And it's funny that you pick carrots and meat, because one of my pet peeves is, why aren't perishables, the stuff that you buy in the produce section, why don't those have nutritional labels? One of my favorite examples is bananas. They've got 15 grams of sugar. A single banana is 15 grams of sugar. Everyone talks about them being high potassium. Yes, relatively speaking, compared to other things. By the way, they're not that high, but they're higher. It's an index question. Whereas instead, I think we should be focusing on the fact that it's 15 grams of sugar in every single banana. So I would love to see a world where the produce department, instead of it just saying apples, it actually said, here is the nutritional content in an apple. And, another pet peeve is, we spoke a little bit about some of the claims, but for example, all of those produce products can make nutritional claims without being verified for fiber. So Apple can go out there and call itself high fiber, even though it's high sugar. I can't call my product high fiber because it's high fat, because I'm fat being maligned. So you just touched on a nerve of like carrots, meat, produce, labeling, fiber claims, all with just that one comment. So, but at the core of it is this wish that we move the conversation from being what the product comes in to the core nutrients that are in the product. And maybe that's the physicist in me that's, going down to the atomic level and then smaller to the nuclear level. But I would love it if it was less about maligning food categories and was more about the nutrients that you're actually getting from the food.
So, okay. So, you have mentioned we mentioned your company a couple times. Just tell us a little bit about it. And, I'm curious to hear about, I understand why you started, but like, I'm curious about the actual like mechanics of coming up with your own snack bar and getting it approved and then for sale. Could you tell us a little bit about that story?
Of course. So I call myself an accidental entrepreneur, which apparently don't exist. But I left PepsiCo and did the classic, my version of Eat, Pray, Love, traveling around the world. And during that time, I met another physicist who'd been keto for some time. And I, we had kind of one of those set twos on nutrition. And I effectively lost by the end of this conversation. And after going deep into this long, big hole on sort of keto research, I emerged on the other side convinced that sugar is something that is like water dripping on a rock, in that it causes damage, not in any individual bite that you eat, but over time and in our population as humans as a whole. And at the time, I was trying to work out what to do with my life and getting a new job, and ended up going through this whole analysis of like the biggest drivers um, of social distress in our world. And it turns out obesity is number 3 after armed violence and smoking. I'm like, hold on, these are like things I know something about. And I'd found going keto and eliminating sugar and carb from my diet super hard as a non-meat eater, because vast majority of the keto people tend to lean on meats or animal products. And even in the snack bar world, they often have whey proteins or they have eggs, or alternative, they have honey. So it was incredibly challenging to find something to snack on. And I also hate to cook. I don't want to learn. So I wanted something that was real food. So I came up with this idea of taking mini meals like curry and Thai and Tex-Mex and pizza, and squishing them into bar form. And it was, I won't lie, it was super challenging because those sugars are cheap and the animal products are what binds things together. So it was a lot of actually super, looking back, super clever food science, but at the time, just a lot of kitchen experimentation and multiple pilots. And at the end of it, we did manage to take the carbs out and make a product that tastes really good. And one of the reasons I love what you said about nutrient density is because we actually chose to add in freeze-dried ingredients, which are massively nutrient dense because they are 10th of the size of eating the whole piece. And because you're not shipping the water, they end up being super sustainable. So we came up with this like hyper compressed mini meal that is actually good for you and doesn't have any other bad stuff. We even left out flavorings and we use real spices. And every one of these steps was challenging from a food production and packaging side. And by the way, we decided to make them to keto macros, so you wouldn't actually have to count and do any of this math that's on a nutritional label. And we have our own way of labeling where we've actually already done the percent of calories math for you. So it's kind of a lot of thinking in a single product, but the core of it is this wish to make healthy eating really easy and try and get people to switch from one sugary or carb-laden salty snack to something that doesn't have sugar in it. And that's it. Just if I could get everyone to switch one snack away from sugar, we would have huge impact in the world. So that's at the core of it.
What was the process to come up with the sort of the recipe, and then did you first sort of do it in a kitchen, and then how do you actually start getting these bars made industrially? How does that work? Is that contract manufacturing? Do you give them the recipe and they scale it up like by a factor of 100,000, or what's that like?
So it started in my kitchen. It started from something I ate myself. That's at its genesis point. And then the recipe development, you'll find this funny. I was trying to work out how to make it not just my product, but everyone's product. So the 4 dishes are the most ordered plant-based dishes on Seamless, literally based on the recommendations. And the spice mixes, which are really core to the flavor here, are, are actually based on the most popular recipes that are online. And then, of course, I had some fabulous chefs to help me actually tweak them and make them fabulous. But at the core of the ingredients, those are actually sourced from online recipe popularity, and have a whole big spreadsheet on them. So it's kind of funny. It's like geek meets gourmet in the recipe development phase.
That's such a
And
genius
then,
idea. Well, I got to ask you, that's such a genius idea to rather than think, oh, what would people like? Just say, oh, let me just go to Seamless and how did that work? You were able to somehow scan it or get the data to figure out what was the most popular, you
They
know,
tell you they're bestsellers.
okay. All right.
They literally mark their bestsellers. Um,
And what were the best sellers that inspired your four different flavors?
so they're a mush up, and this is why we say we're inspired by different dishes. For example, in Thai food, it's pad Thai, it's tom kha, and I'd have to look up the one other one. And in the Tex-Mex, it is chile, elote, and uh, chile, elote, and one other thing. Salsa probably, but I don't think it was I think salsa didn't come from Seamless. So it's like this mush up of the most popular recipes. They are not any one recipe. They're a version of fusion cooking.
And then but when you test them in your kitchen, I mean, some of the ingredients are, I believe, not necessarily things you can find in your local grocery store, right? So, or correct me if I'm wrong. So, how did you kind of get the bulk ingredients to do the test kitchen work?
So they are actually, with the exception of the fiber that we use to bind the product, everything you can find in your kitchen cupboard. Depending on how fancy you are, if you have lemongrass and tomatillo and some of the fancier spices that we ended up using to get just the right accents, it was actually really important to me to not use processed food alternatives. For example, not using flavors is very unusual in this industry. I use real spices, and that's actually where it's fine to make the sample at home, but to make it commercially gets very challenging for the food scientists are probably going, oh my God, you can't use real spices. They've got very high mold levels. And I actually had to get very high up in the value chains, which my food experience, I think, allowed me to do, to source as close to the original purchasers as possible so that you get the highest quality product. And then I spent a very long time on choosing the packaging to make sure that we have just the right oxygen barriers and to reduce any of the enzymatic reactions or or the oxidation reactions going off in the packaging. So it starts off in the kitchen, and then when you start to develop a commercial product, it gets way more complicated. But I always try to solve for it by getting the best available initial ingredient as opposed to leaning on sort of food technology.
And then,
I invested in the packaging and kept the packaging fancy as opposed to messing with the purity of my ingredients.
yes, say something more about that. So, you're kind of a naive consumer wouldn't necessarily notice the difference, but what is sort of high tech or different about the packaging of your products?
It's the key differentiator is that oxygen barrier, and the simple check is just how thick is the film. One of the things that's funny is as soon as the film gets thicker, it gets harder to seal because you have to like heat press it together. So you're always playing with these compromises to get things just right. And actually, one of the reasons we left our packaging silver looking is that it's kind of close to how you'd wrap food in silver foil. We're trying to give this sense that it is as fresh as it could be because it's foil wrapped.
Fantastic. Tekla, if people wanted to find out more about your campaign on nutrition facts, where can they go? And if they want to find out more about your snack bars, where can they go?
In order to join our nutrition effort, please just email me. I am Tekla, Tekla, at Keho, KEHO.life. Anyone and everyone is welcome. We're in the early stages and we plan to build a big grassroots movement. And the site for the product is keho.life, KEHO.life, because it's a lifestyle, not a company. So it's a life as opposed to .com.
Fantastic. Tekla, thank you so much for joining today. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Awesome. Thank you for having me. And thank you for listening to my nerding out on 2 inches by 3 inches of a nutritional label.
Fantastic.